Call the member for Melbourne.
Deputy Speaker, this is Parliament's asbestos moment. This is Parliament's tobacco moment. This is the moment when we had all the facts at our fingertips and had to make a decision about whether to act. This is the point where we knew that the way we'd been doing things up until now was no longer sustainable. And this is the point where we decide whether, simply because there are some large companies that are making a lot of money out of hurting people and hurting the planet, we let them keep going, or whether we do the right thing by the community and by our children. Mr Deputy Speaker, Australia for many, many years has been powered by coal. And our electricity networks really are a series of copper lines out to coal mines. This has happened for a good part of 2 centuries, not because a group of people sat around and worked out how they could do the most damage to the society, but it happened because us here in Australia for many years, like the rest of the world, thought that you could dig up coal and burn it for free. We thought that it was, to use the terminology of the last century that's still repeated by the government, we thought it was a cheap source of energy. But what we are realising, and what we've now known for at least a couple of decades and probably longer, is that when you dig up fossil fuels and burn them, you put pollution into the atmosphere. It's basic physics. And that when you put pollution into the atmosphere, if you do it on a worldwide scale and you do it long enough, you start to change the planet's temperature. The greenhouse effect kicks in, as it used to be called. Now, we are put on notice that as surely as night follows day, that if we keep burning fossil fuels, we will heat the planet up. And what is incontrovertible is that since the beginning of the industrial era, we collectively as a species, despite all the amazing things we have done, have also heated the planet by about 0.8 of a degree. And what we also know, because the scientists have been telling us until they reach the point of despair, what we also know is that even if we turned off all pollution in the world tomorrow, lags in the climate system mean we've heated up the planet by about another 0.7, 0.8 degrees. So we're up close to about 1.6 degrees. Now, 1.6 degrees might not sound like a lot, but the thing is, Mr Deputy Speaker, the planet, it's not like this room where you can turn the thermostat up and down and adjust the temperature. The planet is more like the human body, where you have a narrow range of temperatures within which your body can be safe, and any doctor will tell you that if the body gets too hot or the body gets too cold, they might not be able to tell you exactly which organ will fail, they might not be able to tell you exactly how sick you'll get, but they tell you that you don't want to go there and you want to stay within the safe range. Now, the planet has a safe range, and the scientists, again, have been telling us, until they are blue in the face, that we can't heat this planet by more than about 2 degrees, or we run the risk of runaway climate change. And that means things might start happening that we can no longer control. So, for example, in the Arctic, not only will the Arctic start melting faster, but feedback loops may kick in, where you shrink the space of white, and that means there's more dark space, so as the sun comes down it absorbs the heat, because white reflects but the dark absorbs it. And so that means it heats up the ocean, and that means it melts quicker, and the loop kicks in. And they tell us that we may not be able to stop these kind of feedback loops, and if we want a better than even chance of staying safe, we would stay below the 2-degree guardrail. But as I've just said, Mr Deputy Speaker, we know that we're already at about 1.6 and 1.7. And that means the decisions that we make within the next couple of decades are crucial. It's why the Climate Commission called this the critical decade, because they are saying it is not free to pollute. It is not a cheap source of energy. It comes at a massive cost to the planet and to the people on the planet. And so you've really got two choices when faced with that. You either say to the big polluters in this country and elsewhere, we are now going to make you pay for the cost, or at least part of it, of the pollution that you are putting into the atmosphere that affects our health and that affects our way of life. And that's the approach that currently exists. Or you do what the government is proposing, which is to say, no, tell you what, rather than the big polluters paying the government and we give half that money to households, what we will do instead is make households pay to give money to the big polluters to keep on polluting. And that is the absurd choice that we are being faced with this set of bills, and that the government wants to rush through this parliament today. In 2010, after the election in 2010, we were in the position, as the Greens, to secure action on global warming. And working together with the then Labor government and other members of the crossbench, we put a price on pollution. And in addition, we secured things that had never been secured before in this country. A Clean Energy Finance Corporation that would put $10 billion into cleaner renewable energy in this country so that Australia could become a renewable energy powerhouse, so that we had something to sell the rest of the world in 15 years' time that wasn't just coal and gas, but that was clean energy technology. We secured ARENA, $3 billion to go into early-stage research and development for solar and wind farms around this country. And we secured the Climate Change Authority that would give this government independent advice about just how quickly we needed to act on global warming if we wanted to preserve the Australian way of life. Those were things that had never been put on the table by any political party other than the Greens before, and we secured them in 2010. And I thank the previous Labor government for delivering on that. And I thank the members of the crossbench for working to deliver on that, because we did something that hadn't been done before. We had Conservative country independents, Progressive city independents, the Greens and Labor all on the same page, informed by experts, coming up with a way of putting a price on pollution and putting the money then into compensation for households and into developing clean energy in this country. But we're now at the point where some of that looks like it's going to go, but some of it looks like it's going to stay. And in that respect, I want to note the Palm United Party senators who have agreed to keep those gains secured by the Greens. ARENA, the CEFC, the Climate Change Authority, and also, of course, securing the renewable energy target. That is very, very important, and I thank them for that. But I say this to everyone in this chamber. There's two types of denial about climate change. There's denying the science, which is what our Prime Minister is famous for, and most of this government is famous for. But then there's the denying of the consequences of the science. Because the thing about believing in climate change, you can't be half pregnant. Once you accept that global warming is real, then it means we have to act, us now have to act, if we want to make sure that we preserve the Australian way of life for the rest of us in this country and everyone who comes after us. And in that respect, I say to Labor, to the extent that this forces you to go back to the drawing board, please break your bipartisan agreement with the Coalition for an appalling 5% emissions reduction. That is a death sentence. That is a death sentence. And if you go to the next election saying 5% cut in pollution is enough, you will be condemned, just as the Coalition is being condemned. Because the reality is, at the moment, that for so long as we have a government saying science of climate change is absolute crap and people can keep on polluting as the way that they have, with a 5% emissions reduction target that's not even legally binding. You know it's not legally binding, and the Minister for Environment knows it's not legally binding, because the government has said if the money runs out, we won't keep spending to reach 5%. We'll happily reach 3 or 4, maybe. We know that in the face of that coming from this government, the two biggest threats to the Australian way of life are global warming and Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister. Because this Prime Minister is writing for this country a prescription for more bushfires happening more often, more intense weather events and more heat waves. Now, I don't know about you, Mr Deputy Speaker, but I don't want to go to every Christmas holidays worrying about where the next bushfire is going to hit, or worrying how many people are going to die from the heat waves. But what we know, because the scientists employed by the government have told us over and over again, is that in Victoria, for example, unless we get global warming under control, expect to see something like the Black Saturday bushfires happening on average every 2 years. And they tell us that Melbourne's climate will become like Cowra, and they tell us that Darwin, they can't find an analogous place on Earth to describe what Darwin will be like under 4 degrees of warming, because that is what is in store. And we are doing this a very short period of time after scientists have also told us that they fear the West Antarctic ice sheet may be irreversibly melting. Faced with the biggest ever threat to our way of life, our Prime Minister chooses a policy of appeasement. This is an appeasing government that is selling out our future and is one of the biggest threats to our way of life that we have seen. Ronald Reagan, hardly someone I quote often, but Ronald Reagan said the first duty of every government is to protect its people. Well, Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister, is failing in that duty. He is failing in that duty because he is giving Australians a prescription for a worse way of life. Deputy Speaker, you may not know it, but in the summer accompanying the Black Saturday bushfires, more people died from the heat waves than died in the bushfires themselves. And that is what we know is in store for us here in Australia. The vulnerable, the poor, the elderly, those who can't afford to fit out their houses with air conditioning the same way that others might be able to, the ones whose health is already frail, they are the ones who are going to suffer the most thanks to this government. And in recognition of the fact that if we are to accept the science of climate change, you have to accept the consequences of that science, I move the following amendment. I move that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting the following words. The House declines to give the bill a second reading and 1. Notes that the world is on track for 4 degrees of warming, and 2. Warming of less than 1 degree is already intensifying extreme weather events in Australia and around the world with enormous costs to life and property. And 2. Calls on the government to protect the Australian people and environment from climate change by approving no new coal mines or extensions of existing mines or new coal export terminals. And 2. Adopt a trajectory of 40 to 60% below 2000 levels by 2030 and net carbon zero by 2050 emissions reduction target in global negotiations for a 2015 treaty. And I so move. So, Deputy Speaker, in the last minute and a half, as many people in Melbourne know, it's the science of climate change that led me to quit my job and start running in elections. The understanding that we have a decade or two to turn the ship around, or else we are in serious trouble. The understanding that global warming is already influencing the extreme weather that we are seeing. And of course, the understanding now that recently we have just experienced the hottest year, hottest month, hottest day on record. And the understanding that if you are under 30 in this world, you have never experienced a March that is cooler than the average March, or a January that's cooler than the average January. In other words, if you are under 30, you have never experienced a cooler than average month on this planet. It was in light of all of that that I started running in elections and got involved in politics. I feel incredibly proud to have achieved the laws that we are debating here today, some of which may be repealed but some of which may be kept. But this isn't about me, or really about any of us in here. This is about the rest of the country and all of those who are coming after us, and whether we are prepared to be the next James Hardie or the next British American tobacco.
Order. I thank the honourable member for